Hello, welcome to the International Business Conversations. My name is Irina Goch, and today my guest is Dr. Neil Pyper. Neil, hello, how are you?
Hi, thanks for having me.
So today we're talking with Neil about political environment. That is one of the key elements, key facets of the international business environment. Can you please introduce yourself and tell me what you do?
Okay, so I am a senior lecturer in international business at Birkbeck in London, and I have been teaching and doing a little bit of research in this area for about 9 years now. Before that, for about 11 years, I was a political risk analyst and consultant. So I try to bring that kind of practical experience into my teaching as much as I can.
Can you please share some of the main takeaways from the job of political risk analyst that you did for 11 years?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a tendency, especially when people are thinking about developed and advanced economies, to think of the political environment as a given and to assume that politics in the future will be much the same as politics is now. And what I saw was history repeating itself constantly. So people would take politics as a given, something disruptive would happen, people would be surprised, people would reflect on the fact that politics is actually A, really important, and B, really quite unpredictable, even in relatively stable political systems. And then things would go back to normal again, and people would go back to taking politics as a given. And then something disruptive would happen again. And so the cycle would repeat. So if you do a search in the Financial Times, there have been a number of articles written over the years about how suddenly politics is important for business. And basically making the point that it's not possible to take politics and the stability of the political environment as a given. And I think it's interesting that this phenomenon that keeps happening, and as the experience of the US between 2016 and 2021 shows, can even happen in sort of very well established stable democracies. I think it's interesting that periodic disruption and periodic instability takes people for granted, takes people by surprise. And I think it's interesting. So you look at a country like Peru now, and Peru is probably the country that I'm most interested in, that I did my PhD in. And Peru had been hailed as a kind of major success story that had entered a new era of stability at, say, the beginning of the 2020s. And we're seeing an electoral process in Peru now that shows that that stability was, at best, temporary and at worst an illusion. And that kind of brings home to me that again and again and again, there is the assumption that something has happened that is fixed, is the way that things are going to be from now on. Things like Gordon Brown saying in the 2000s that the era of boom and bust were over, and it never works like that. So I think those are among the key things that I would take away. So certainly in my teaching, I emphasize that you have to understand politics, that it's impossible to avoid politics if you're involved in any kind of business, international or domestic, and that politics can be unpredictable, unstable, and surprising, even in the most stable and unsurprising countries in people's minds.
I think it's very important to emphasize the decision-making process. So it's not just for us reading newspapers, it's for managers, for those who are involved in managing multinationals or smaller companies that are engaged in international business to understand that uncertainty is there and being able to detect the future trends, political trends before they emerge might be one of the crucial skills, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that it's easy to forget about politics is that fundamentally politics is about human beings with their human failings and their human whims. And an awful lot of political decisions that have really quite serious and far-reaching implications are made based on essentially the whims of an individual or a group of people, and can depend on things like how someone's feeling on a particular day. So I think, yeah, that absolutely, that is quite important. The other thing that I think is important is that, we teach all sorts of management theories routinely, but to me, business is still fundamentally all about relationships. And, in my experience, both in my academic work and in what I did before, where business deals have failed, it has been because of a breakdown in relationships. And again, politics is all about relationships and about people. So yeah, that's really important.
Can we please talk a bit more about your academic work and how your experience of being political risk analyst now impacting what you do in your academic work in class, for
Yes.
example?
So, I mean, I think my research has been in the area of strategic foresight and scenario analysis. And my academic background is in a field, in a different field. It's not in business. The thing that got me interested in management as a discipline was doing an executive education program in scenario analysis in Oxford in the mid-2000s. And that fascinated me because it's essentially all about how to deal with uncertainty and how to think about a future that inherently we can't kind of know ahead of time. And so, and having sort of had that overview of scenario analysis, I got really interested in how that relates to analyzing the macro environment, so political, macroeconomic risk, etc. And that drew more and more into my work when I was a political risk analyst, and essentially that offered the bridge that then kind of took me into the academic world. And I've published a handful of papers on strategic foresight and scenario analysis since then. And I just think it's a really, really interesting paradox that we are, if you like, cognitively conditioned to think that the future is going to be pretty much like the present. Perhaps there'll be a few little differences at the edges, but fundamentally things will be about the same. And actually, it never works like that. So first of all, highly disruptive events happened, and we're in the middle of a highly disruptive event. And then also, fundamentally, we can't know the future, and there are lots of sort of small things that cumulatively mean that certainly, if I look back to my life 20 years ago and think about how I would have imagined things panning out, they haven't panned out anything like how I've imagined. And I think that goes for most people, and I think it goes for most organizations as well. So on the one hand, experience and evidence shows us that over the course of times things change and change pretty fundamentally. However, we're conditioned to think that things are going to more or less remain the same.
I think it's a very interesting discussion on its own that perhaps taps into the behavioral economics and behavior of
Absolutely.
people. And it's very interesting, but I do agree. We need to think more about uncertainty, and we need to accept that future is uncertain. One of the things that I wanted to ask, when we teach international business, political environment as such is playing a big role in the curriculum. So we do talk a lot about political environment as being a central element in the international business decision-making process. Can you maybe summarize why that is so?
I think, I mean, to go back to what I said a few minutes ago, it is, I mean, we've heard a lot over recent years, and I've certainly heard from people I know, the idea that politics doesn't really affect me and I'm not interested in politics and things like that. And the reality is that it's impossible to do any kind of business without engaging at some level with politics and with government. Even if someone runs a sort of corner shop, there are regulations that they have to comply with. And obviously kind of bigger companies have to engage even more with possibly the outcomes of political decision-making processes. And then, for me, the difference fundamentally between international business and just business is that any kind of international business activity adds a layer of complexity. And that complexity also extends to the idea of having to deal with multiple sets of regulations, perhaps having to deal with government officials in different countries, having to obey different sets of laws, and have ways of ensuring legal compliance. And essentially, I think that is the key thing. Now, my view, quite often when I teach international business courses, there is quite a lot of broader political discussion, because I think it is a mistake to teach about or to look at the political environment from the point of view of international business just from the perspective of companies and businesses themselves, because it's far more reaching than that. So, for example, if you look at what's happening in the UK in the post-Brexit period, what you see is political decisions about things like immigration, consumer rights, things like that, having pretty significant knock-on implications that will affect companies and will affect the nature of international business operations and dealings.
So regulations, different emerging themes in the government, they affect business. Can you maybe summarize what are the most common political risks in the international environment or on the global
Yes.
environment, on the global level?
So, on the global level, when I've worked on political risk rating tools, it tends to be things like expropriation risk, sovereign default risk, things like that. To my mind, the key risk is, and this might sound quite broad, the risk of instability. So, generally those involved in international business like working within stable and relatively predictable political environments, and find it challenging when it's not clear how the rules of the game work or how they might change. So I would say that stability, and I suppose by extension predictability, is a key thing. Then I think, obviously you can't disaggregate the political risk, the political environment and political risk from economic risk. So, alongside political stability, macroeconomic stability, and most importantly, stable rules of the macroeconomic game, I think are really important.
Do you have any solution or at least a path to how multinationals can adjust better to those simultaneously conflicting and uncertain environments?
To my mind, it's all about agility. So, those of us who are interested in strategy know that big companies make strategic plans that then become a sort of section on a website or a brochure that gets stuck in a drawer. Companies that are really successful, I think, are able to identify when things are not panning out the way you would expect, and they're able to sort of change course and make the necessary adjustments. And that is why, for example, scenario analysis is such a useful tool. So the main methodology that's used for scenario analysis was developed within Shell in the 1970s. And, Shell grew significantly during that period because it was able to respond to fluctuations in oil prices, essentially, more quickly and more creatively than the other oil majors. So I think that's the key thing. Now, it's very easy for someone like me to say that companies need to be able to be more agile and to change course more quickly when things aren't working out as planned. It's not as simple as that, but I think that's the starting point in terms of adapting effectively to a volatile political environment.
We always talk about institutions when we talk about political environment. So what is the role of institutions in the context of political environment?
Yeah, so I think institutions can be the sort of bedrock that provides stability. So, if you look at countries that are typically more stable, at the more stable end, if you like, of a spectrum from stability to instability. And I'm thinking about, for example, the Scandinavian countries. What you see are very, very strong institutions that remain stable even when there's a change of government. And what we've seen, for example, in the experience of Latin America over the past 15 years, is that embedding institutional stability is a long and challenging process. And it doesn't take very much, as we're seeing in Peru at the moment, for and actually we've seen in Peru over the past couple of years, it doesn't take much for what looks like a significantly different institutional landscape that's more stable than in the past to unravel and become much less stable again. So I think building institutions takes time, and it requires a degree of commitment from actors across the political spectrum. And that commitment, as we've seen in the US and in other countries over the past 6-7 years, that commitment cannot be taken for granted, and for various reasons can be withdrawn.
Let's talk about Latin America. And
Okay.
you mentioned that you've done research on Latin America. Can you please share some of the interesting examples from that research that can inform our discussion today and be useful for students?
Yeah, first of all, in my academic work, I haven't done very much on Latin America. What I did was to focus on Latin America almost completely throughout my career as a political risk analyst, and I still do some work in that area. What is interesting to me, as someone who's followed Latin American politics for a long period of time now, is to see some of the phenomena that people had thought were sort of confined to Latin America and to other, if you like, emerging market contexts. So I'm thinking about things like political and economic populism become a phenomenon in developed and advanced economies as well. So I think that's been interesting. I think Latin America is fascinating at the moment. The region, as is well known, has been very badly hit by COVID, and there's likely to be fundamental change in a number of areas, including political institutions, once the pandemic passes, which isn't going to be for quite a long time, I don't think, in that part of the world. But the big thing that I think is that, we've seen historical cycles in Latin America of economic boom and bust based largely on commodity exports and commodity prices. And we've seen largely accompanying those cycles periods of relative political stability, whether democratic or authoritarian, which have then passed. And as I said a few minutes ago, it was interesting in the 2000s to hear the arguments being made for Latin America having turned a corner in terms of political stability and institutions having strengthened, and, for example, social policies becoming embedded as a result of high levels of economic growth and sort of tentative moves towards establishing welfare states. And that coincided with the kind of commodities super cycle, an unusually long period of high commodities prices. I think it's interesting now that we're seeing that appears to have been largely an illusion. So if you take a country like Peru, yes, there was a sustained period of very high economic growth there was also a sustained period of high commodity prices. Yes, there was the emergence of a strong construction sector and a strong retail sector, and growth and development of the major cities, but that wasn't really about the economy diversifying. That was about sort of spillover effects of commodity-led economic growth. Commodity prices are no longer what they were. We're seeing the Peruvian economy not having collapsed as in other sort of commodity-led boom and bust cycles, but nowhere near as strong as it was. And we're seeing really a quite striking breakdown of the political stability that had been there. And what that says to me is that this sort of cyclical nature of political and economic change, if you like, actually is continuing. So what happened in the 2000s was not really a break from what had happened previously. It was a continuation with a sort of accentuated boom as a result of some of the consequences of globalization.
Let's now talk about your traveling through Latin America and diverge from the topic of political risks. Can you please tell me some of your recollections, that something interesting that happened, something that you saw during your traveling, during your journey through Latin America?
Okay, so I was introduced to Latin America at a pretty young age and in a pretty unusual way, I suppose. So I spent my last 2 years of high school at an international school in New Mexico in the US. Um, and it was very much a Latin American experience. I mean, I had the opportunity to travel in northern Mexico, which was hugely formative, but also, at that time, which was early 90s, I was aware that a growing number of people spoke Spanish in the US. I didn't realize that there were parts of the US that were essentially Spanish speaking or largely Spanish speaking, and where Spanish had always been spoken. And where I was in New Mexico was one of those areas. So I didn't, it came as a huge sort of eye opener to me, to be in a part of the US that in many ways was also part of Latin America. So when I was there, I had a couple of trips to northern Mexico. Again, sort of the contrast between the US and the Mexican side of the border, and the contrasts in Mexico. So those trips involved going into the mountains, into areas that now, unfortunately, it's difficult to visit because of the drug situation. And again, that was, in a world that was far less globalized, if you like, than it is now. And at the age of 16, 17, that was really, really interesting and eye-opening. And then I did my first degree in Latin American studies, so I focused on that part of the world and spent, well, over the course of my degree and my PhD, about 3 years in Peru. And again, I mean, at that time, the tourist guidebooks and things like that talked about Peru being extremely dangerous, and the cities in Peru being particularly problematic in terms of visiting them. And I suppose sort of spending quite a long time in one place, getting to know people and realizing that people sort of get on with their lives. And yeah, I mean, different places have different challenges that people have to deal with if they live there, and people adapt sometimes quite creatively to the challenges that they find. For example, around security, or around being able to get access to certain things. So that was interesting. And then I suppose the other experience that I've had has been going back to countries in Latin America, having been away for a long time. So I went to Mexico in 1993 Then I went back in 2006. Then I went back in 2018 at the very end, and sort of seeing how a country changes when you're away with such a big gap between each visit. And again, I left Peru in 1999 and went back in 2015. And that's a really fascinating kind of window on a country, to see it again, having been away for an extended period of time. So in the case of Peru in particular, seeing what a doubling of GDP, which is what happened in the time when I was away, seeing what that looks like on the ground was really, really eye-opening.
Did your traveling change the way how you look at everyday things?
I mean, I think I'm probably relatively unusual in that, because I spent so many of my formative years in that part of the world, and I'm talking about my sort of late teens, early 20s. My reference point very often when I am, for example, discussing something in a class isn't the UK and isn't Europe. It's Latin America. That's what I know. So I know that, for example, I have taught courses in the past where students are bemused by the fact that when I'm explaining something, I very often explain it by making reference to Latin America. I mean, I think those of us who, and I'm talking those of us from the UK, especially now at a time when the UK has become very inward looking. I think those of us who've had the opportunity to live and work elsewhere and experience other worldviews are in a very kind of privileged position. So, I think, I mean, certainly, I have an 8-year-old son, and I am going to be encouraging him to get the sort of experiences that I had in terms of travel. Maybe not in Latin America. It depends what he will be interested in the sense that I think being able to appreciate all sorts of things from other perspectives is really, really important. And I think travel doesn't always do that. I've met plenty of people who are well traveled and who don't have those multiple perspectives, but very often it does, and that's important.
Can you please offer a word of
Yeah.
advice to students?
Okay, my advice to students is very simple. If you study and do what you're really, really interested in, things like jobs and careers will sort themselves out. So I did a degree that no longer exists because it's judged not to be useful. At the time that I did it, various people questioned whether I was making a sensible choice. We live we live at a moment now where language departments are being closed down at a number of universities, and basically I studied what I studied because it was what I really, really loved. And what I found is that, first of all, I've been able to sort of adapt my skills and interests over the years. But also, fundamentally, an awful lot of careers and career opportunities don't really depend on what you've studied. So, I say to anybody who questions whether studying, for example, languages, or it could be humanities, it could be history. I would question anybody who says that those things aren't useful, on the basis that um, you never know what direction your career is going to take. And I also think that the fact that you're working on something that you're really, really interested in and passionate about is apparent to people and goes quite a long way. So, for example, even though Latin America is not a part of the world that's of huge interest to many people in the UK, other than as a holiday destination at the moment, my interest in Latin America has taken me a very long way professionally. So I think that's the key thing. You know, I teach a lot, or well, maybe not now actually because of the nature of my job, but in the past I have taught an awful lot of business students who don't really want to study business and are not really interested in it and are doing it because they have the idea that it will get them a good job. And I would say, you know, study what you're really interested in and what you're passionate about, and everything else will work itself out further down the line. That's my experience anyway.
I think it's a great advice to follow your passion and to do what you like. But I also wanted to add to this that sometimes we don't know what we like. We don't know what we want, and exploring what we want is also part of this journey, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I'm very lucky in that it was very clear. It was very clear to me from the age of about 14 what I was really interested in. And I know that doesn't happen to everyone. But John Kay, who is a reasonably well-known economist, wrote a really good book a few years ago about how the path from A to B, whether that be professionally or in all sorts of other areas, is rarely a straight line. It goes off at all sorts of tangents and things like that. And I think that's really important. You know, so the idea that if you don't do, if you don't do a business degree or a maths degree or whatever now, you won't have a good career is a huge red herring, I think.
Thank you very much, Neil, for such a great interview. I really enjoyed it. And
thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.